really structure a song extremely well.
Well, this album, like you said, it kind of goes from up-tempo funk to a little bit of disco to ballad, breezy stoner anthem to ballad to up-tempo funk.
Yeah.
Speak Easy Studios. Speak and be heard.
Yo, this is Stephen Lee.
And I'm Frank Jackson.
And we are the Distinguished Critics. We're here to break down some of our favorite albums and songs and debate what's overrated, underrated, and everything in between. So join us as we go back and relive some of music's most iconic projects. Give us a listen wherever you get your podcasts, and please remember to rate, review, subscribe, and give us those 5 stars. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another edition of This or That. I'm Stephen Lee, as always, joined by Frank Jackson, and today we will be shifting gears. That's right, we're taking it all the way back to the 70s with 2 orchestrators of funk, in particular P-Funk and Punk Funk. That's right, we're talking about Rick James' debut, Come Get It, released in April of 1978, and Parliament's Mothership Connection, released in December of 1975. Frank, how you doing today, man?
Good, man. I'm excited to switch it up a little bit. We enjoy talking hip-hop, but I think even more so, we probably enjoy the oldies
right
a little bit more. It's
the foundation.
It's interesting when you listen to music from different eras and discover kind of where things came from, where they originated. So much of the things we heard growing up, we at the time have no idea that like this thing's birth was 40 years ago. It could be a sample, or it could be just a line from a song back then that got turned into a hook that became a famous hip hop song. And when we're talking about these 2 artists in particular, or this group and this artist in particular, they gave birth to so much of what we talk about and so many of the things that we will discuss on this podcast. So.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. When we decided to kind of step out of, I don't want to say our comfort zone, because we do enjoy talking about this music, but this was probably the most intimidating 2 albums I think that we could choose to tackle, at least for me personally, because I hold both of these artists in such high regard that you want to make sure you're doing them justice when discussing these 2 seminal albums. So one question I had for you, just to kind of kick it off, because we didn't necessarily grow up with this music on the radio, is when was the first time that you remember hearing Parliament, Funkadelic, and Rick James? So
Parliament, that was just one of those things where it's funny, as a kid, you're riding, road trip or whatever. I got family in Tampa. We'd take a road trip to Tampa, and my parents would be playing their music, and, as a kid, I hated it. And I remember, hearing Flashlight and at the time, it was just like, man, what is this shit? Like, it's crazy how different it sounds to me now. It's a masterpiece. But, so my exposure to Parliament was very young. As far as Rick goes, probably somewhere around late middle school is when I like started to kind of put together who Rick James really even was. And I would say it was before the whole Chappelle thing.
Yeah, that was going to be brought up in some capacity.
It was before the whole Chappelle thing, but that as many people didn't in our age group, had no idea that Rick was that wild. And then when you learn about him, he is infinitely wilder than even that. But
the epitome of like the bad boy.
That was the watered down version, really. As far as Rick goes, it's the most people's first exposure to Rick is the street songs stuff. You're gonna hear Super Freak probably before you hear anything from Rick James
that we're discussing today, or
and if it's not, it would be Mary Jane, maybe.
That's a big one, man.
So I was very young for Parliament, fairly young for Rick.
So confession time for Stephen Lee. The first time I ever heard about Rick James was from Chappelle's Show. When I was younger, and when I say younger than, because Chappelle's Show came out in 02, 03, so we're like 12, 13 at the time.
Right.
I had heard Super Freak and Give It To Me Baby and Mary Jane, but I never put the two together that, okay, this is all from this artist.
No more so the song than the artist.
Correct.
Yeah.
And when I was younger and getting into music heavy, and I'm talking even like 8 or 9 years old, I was kind of in two different boxes. It was hip hop and just starting to discover what my flavor and taste was in hip hop, and really Motown. So it was a lot of Marvin Gaye. It was the Temps. It was the Four Tops. I didn't even realize like Rick was associated with Motown and all of this, and we'll get into that. But
numerous times
that came a lot later for me.
Yes.
Parliament, same year to be honest. Went and saw Undercover Brother in theaters, classic Eddie Griffin film. And that's when I heard Parliament, and I was like, oh, I like this. And you could hear, I want to say The Wash, too. I don't know if you remember the movie The Wash with Snoop and Dre.
Of course.
But that scene where they're playing Not Just Knee Deep, and I'm like, God damn, what is that? You know, so I would say around 12 or 13 is the time that I first heard them and got into their music gradually and deeply as the years went on.
Yeah, I mean, the funk would just smack you in the face. It's really one of those things where you kind of do remember the first time it enters you, and it just never leaves.
Which doesn't happen like with a lot of other songs and artists.
Right.
Where
It's
sticks.
so funny you mentioned that Undercover Brother, because I love that movie, and that's exactly what I associate that song
P-Funk
with.
Yeah.
Is him at the opening to that movie.
Yeah.
Him just driving with the orange soda that he did the donuts in the car and the soda didn't spill out the cup. Like, it was just the smoothest shit to coincide with the movements and the song. And it's one of those things that does paint a picture for me. Like, even if I had heard that song prior to that, that's what embedded it in me.
Right.
Like, and I just
the visuals and everything,
things.
'cause, like, there's no music videos back then, but like the 70s.
It just made it cool as shit to me.
Oh, yeah. A classic spoof rather, on blaxploitation.
Yeah.
So, like, the images, it kind of calls you back to, even though we didn't grow up during that era, we've seen several films and documentaries and stuff. Like, the 70s was a special and, like, crazy time as far as music is concerned.
Definitely.
So where do you want to get started? You want to start with Rick? You want to start with Parliament? Figure we do a little bit of a build and talk about where these artists are, as we usually do, and then dive into these albums. But I'm cool starting anywhere because these are two classics.
Let's go with Rick. I do definitely man, the music is incredible on both of these albums. Is just, I mean, these really are two of my favorite albums of all time, period, regardless of genre or but there is so much when it comes to the artists themselves and how influential they were and the lives of them. So I do want to get into that. As excited as I am to talk about the music itself, let's start with Rick.
Yeah, Rick. So Rick kind of exploded on the scene with this album in 78, but a lot of people don't know that he was behind the scenes for so much of this, with Motown even. And even before that, being in a band with Neil Young, the Minor Birds. And there's a lot of history with Rick that I think, like, the casual fan or even, somebody that's moderately into his music wouldn't know. So he starts off with Neil Young. I believe he dodged the draft, right? And he went to Canada and he got caught, and they brought him back, and the whole nine.
So Rick 2 times. So he dodged. He got caught. He got sentenced to, like, hard labor.
Yeah.
And then he escaped, and went back on the run.
Only Rick James
for 6 months.
Yeah.
Went and turned himself back in again. And it should be noted, during this time when he was on the run, he was out there doing his music thing. This was during his second stint with Motown.
Mm-hmm.
they wouldn't release.
Yeah, he was there before, right?
Yeah, he ended up having 3 stints with Motown.
Right. Okay.
They wouldn't release any of his music because they knew about his legal situation. Like,
Right.
if you release music, you're gonna get arrested. So he literally had to. So that blew his entire second stint. And Rick was someone who, and we'll get into. He has a song on this album. Rick was a big dreamer. Like, this was the only thing Rick wanted was that Hollywood fame. Like, he wanted that shit.
He wanted to
so
be the guy.
bad.
And when you look at him coming from Buffalo, it's not hard to see why, right? Like, negative 10 degrees there. Like, what's really going on in Buffalo? No offense to anybody in Buffalo, but like he said it himself, like, I can't just stay here my whole life.
Right.
And, even going back to Motown not really wanting to push him in the early 70s, he changed his name to Ricky James Matthews at the time and actually did like a lot of session work and collaborations with the Funk Brothers. And I know you love that song Out in the Country by David Ruffin.
Yep,
He's playing guitar on that, so Rick was always kind of in the mix, but I think the struggle and being held back is also what led to like
and being
the
that
fire.
being that close to,
right,
to the fame.
seeing like all of these big name artists at the time and, waiting on his chance to blow. And I think that for Rick, it definitely was a long grind. I mean, you're talking about 12 or 13 years before anybody knew him by name.
Yep.
And I've always viewed Rick as an interesting figure in music, period, and I'll tell you why. I don't want to get into the later part of his career today because I'm sure that there'll be an episode where maybe we're reviewing Cold-Blooded or something, right?
Absolutely.
Glow or one of those albums. But one thing that always intrigued me about Rick is Rick kind of held it down in a time where disco died abruptly.
Yeah.
And before the explosion of Prince and Michael Jackson and what we saw the wave become in the 80s with the synthesizers and all of that.
Right.
And that's a hell of a thing to do, right? So Rick not only he kind of bridged the gap between disco and the 80s funk while also helping create that sound.
Right.
But he also held down Motown at a time when Motown was going a different direction. Michael Jackson was leaving for Epic. Diana Ross left. Stevie Wonder at this point, fresh off his extremely historical run in the 70s, was starting to cool down in terms of releasing projects. And Rick kind of anchored that company at a time when it could have gone either way.
Right. And just as a side note, you mentioned Prince and you mentioned Stevie Wonder. So Stevie Wonder was a hero of his, a musical hero of his, and
along with the group that we're going to be talking about after this.
Right. The reason he ended up changing his name, as you mentioned, he used to perform he actually performed under several different names, due in part to his fugitive status, but he settled on Rick James due to the advice given to him by Stevie Wonder, who told him that his name was a little too
wordy.
long.
Yeah.
Like, it just doesn't roll off the tongue.
Right.
And so Rick James.
Yeah,
Ricky
James Matthews actually sounds like some 50s country singer.
That's 100% a country singer. Yeah. So he's the one who suggested to Rick that he just shortened it to, he suggested Ricky James, and Rick just changed it to Rick James. As far as Prince goes, Prince used to open for Rick James,
right?
And they have a famous feud that started with them because of Rick James and all his Rick Jamesness alleged that Prince stole his style on stage and his
the
act.
look.
Yeah, he said Prince stole his act, and so a little feud started there. Prince never wanted to back down from a feuded with Rick James and Michael Jackson.
Yeah, and so here's the thing. I'm glad you brought up the Prince thing because everybody always talks about Prince and Michael's friction. A lot of people don't know that the hate ran much deeper between Prince and Rick James.
Yes.
And both of those artists dropped their debut in 78, but Rick James was certainly the first one to blow. And like you said, Prince was opening up for Rick James. And, I'm not really mad at Rick feeling that way about Prince at the time.
Agreed.
And Prince developed into something bigger than I think anybody could have imagined. But Rick at that time, I think, had a valid point. Just when you look at the way both of them were dressing and presenting themselves and being so, like, I don't want to say androgynous, but they were out there. Flamboyant is the perfect word. Mm-hmm. And you know, that rivalry gets lost in the shuffle, I think, because Rick's own demons got the best of him, and, you know, a decade later, he kind of faded into obscurity or made headlines for all the wrong reasons. Right. But this was a legit competition at first. I mean, if they're really going to see who's the superior artist, Rick more than held his own for the first 3 or 4, 5 years of that, really until, you know, Prince dropped 1999, and there was no looking back after that.
Yeah, I mean, Rick, you know, rightfully so. He saw this guy, and, you know, you can say, and you wouldn't be wrong in saying maybe Rick should have had the foresight to realize, this guy's kind of like me. He's demonstrative. He's flamboyant. It's probably going to take a little bit away from because look, let's be honest. Prince is kind of known for this, right? Like, he'll take the eyes off of you. Right. And people will be more kind of focused on, like, oh,
what was that I just saw? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you're going to follow him and then do some of the same stuff, then yeah, of course, like, he's going to steal the show a little bit. But so Rick, now after doing he ended up getting the sentence taken down from, it would have been 5 years. He ended up getting, I think it was like 6 months or something. He stays the whole time this time. So now he goes to LA and then moves from LA to Detroit. And this is when he works on his solo album, and he drops Come Get It.
Come Get It. Yep, with the Stone City Band.
Yes.
And you know, at this time, it was like Rick James and the Stone City Band. He hadn't gone full-blown, I'm only going by my name. Obviously, they played on the majority of his records throughout his career.
Yes.
But I think it's important to acknowledge their contribution to this project as well, because, and we can go ahead and get into the album, but they anchored this just as much as Rick did, in my opinion. Just
Absolutely.
Musically.
Oh, the instrumentation on this, I mean, this is perfect. Like, he needed them every bit. As a matter of fact, yeah, I mean, he I'll just say that he needed them every bit as much as they needed him as that front man. Rick is, you know, one of these people who, you know, every artist has their thing, right? Some people sing better than others. Some people perform better than others. Some, you know, Rick was never the greatest singer. He's a good singer.
Traditional standards.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're comparing him to, you know, his contemporaries,
right.
Like there's a lot of people who can sing better than Rick. He's more of a crooner, as we've talked about before. But he knew very well how to manipulate his voice, and he was a hell of a performer.
I agree.
And he was a hell of a songwriter. Outstanding songwriter. So Rick on this album and the Stone City Band, look, a lot of people have to run through so many kind of different bands, and you know, he did that stuff early on, but this was the perfect marriage, and it's why they were with him for so much of his career. They're every bit as much of the thing as Rick is. In fact, this episode is Parliament versus Rick, when it's kind of more so Parliament versus Rick and the Stone City Band.
And I think it's especially poignant when discussing Come Get It, because it is the first album, and he's not full-blown Rick James. You know, Super Freak and Give It To Me Baby and Fire and Desire, all that came, you know, 3 or 4 years after.
Right.
So one thing I noticed that, you know, jumped off the page with this album is it is a fantastic blend of ballads and upbeat funk. His funk is a lot more straightforward than the free form that you get from Parliament, right?
Yes.
A Parliament record, in Mothership Connection included, you can throw on, and it's going to sound like one free-form, long jam session.
Yes.
Whereas Rick has, and this isn't a knock, he has more simplistic bass lines. He has more straightforward hooks and verses. It's more palatable to a lot of people than Parliament and what Parliament was doing.
So I think in comparison, it's really that Parliament and it's kind of that Hendrix thing, and that is controlled chaos, and that's not what Rick was. Rick was more buttoned up about his.
He was
like,
and you wouldn't think that, like, just when you say
Right.
Rick James,
Yeah,
like, oh wait,
Rick James certainly wasn't.
His
that,
product
but-
is tighter and it's more polished.
Yeah.
Like, you wouldn't assume that.
Yes, his was more. If I'm picturing it happen, where Rick is like, let's hit every note we have here, and with Parliament, it's like, let's get in there and funk around.
Let's do acid
like,
and see what comes
and
out of it.
see what
Yeah.
comes out of
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
That's literally what it was.
Right.
So yeah, with Rick, and you mentioned his versatility is insane. And this is a good example right here, right, where I love Rick's funk shit. Like it's
The up-tempo stuff.
I love his
Right.
up-tempo funk music, and you're a little bit more partial to his ballads.
Correct.
Though we both love both
Both
of
of
them,
them,
I love his ballads as well. But on this album, he's showcasing that he can just dominate really both aspects of it.
Yeah, Rick, and I feel like we mentioned this in an earlier episode. Rick was a guy that came out with a hit-making formula. Like, there was no, he's finding his way, and on the fourth album he figured it out. And you can't say that for Parliament, right? I mean, their first couple records, and we'll get into them, but
Right.
like, Rick came out the gate, which is almost why it to me, it did work out that he had to wait that long, because by the time this came out in early 78, he knew exactly where he wanted to go with his music.
Yep.
And You and I, the first monster single off this album, I mean, go ahead and talk about that, because it's, to me, one of his greatest singles ever to this day.
Yeah, if I have to pick a top 5 favorite Rick songs, I mean, You and I is very easily
Cemented in there.
on there. It's from the very beginning. This is a song that it's the beat switches from the beginning. It opens a certain way and then the beat drops, and it's just a perfectly orchestrated song to me. And Rick, being the songwriter that he is, it's almost like what I think great songwriters can do? It doesn't have to be the most complex shit. It can be you saying simple things at the right time.
Right.
Like,
And how you deliver it.
and how you deliver it.
Right.
So, I mean, he says, you and I, we fit together like a glove on hand. That's not like some insane, like the
No.
most romantic, but it hits.
yeah.
Like, the way he delivers that is just like, it's perfect. So from the very beginning of the song, it's just like Rick, I would say You and I really showcased, and is why the song was so big. It showcased that Rick really was like, he was a star he was already a star.
Some guys
who was
just have-
now going into his first.
Right. Formal
album.
project.
Yeah.
Some guys just have, quote unquote, it. Right. I mean, the charisma, the delivery, like you said, he's not the greatest vocalist. Like, this isn't Luther Vandross we're talking about,
Right.
but like the way he enunciates and stretches certain words and oohs and ahs. I mean, he knows exactly what he's doing. And one thing that I always loved about this album is, it came out on Motown, as we discussed. He has so many references where he's really talking like some G shit, and Motown doesn't even know it.
Yeah.
Like on You and I, it's like, you and I, we go together till the 6 is 9. It's
Yeah.
like Barry Gordy doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. And there's a song, obviously Mary Jane is probably the biggest example of that, where brass at Motown thought that this was an homage to this girl that he loves, and he's talking about weed, you know? So classic song, by the way.
Rick could sing to a drug like no other. Rick was a freak all the time, right? Like he was very good at making songs that were subtly obvious.
Yeah, they were subtle enough, but like it was like with a wink. It's like, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
you
and
know.
I mean, it's part of what propelled him to where he was and why he was. I mean, women just like Rick was that. Like the women loved Rick, and that's part of it. Like the dude was out there just flaunting the.
He wanted to be a rock star, and that's exactly.
Rick was
he became the embodiment
the
of
sexuality,
that. Right?
Like, and he was so good at. So on this album, there's "Sexy Lady."
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is an up tempo song. This is very It's not disco. It doesn't sound very disco.
Little hint of disco.
A very slight hint of it, but it's still very up tempo
and funky.
But it's still it has like the lyrical feel of a ballad.
Right.
Like he was so good at kind of being a chameleon between both worlds when it came to that. Like he could kind of just jump right into one and out of another and mix them up. And that's what this album, I think, is just a perfect example of. Like, I think Rick was in a creative space when this album came out, and its follow-up. Like, Rick was just kind of on fire mentally. Like, he was able to really structure a song extremely well.
Well, this album, like you said, it kind of goes from up-tempo funk to a little bit of disco to ballad to breezy stoner anthem to ballad to up-tempo funk.
Yeah.
The intro.
But it never ever feels like it's out of place.
Disjointed, right? Yeah, it never feels like, all right, man, this is too much of a shift. Right. I'm in one zone and then you're throwing me into something else. And I can think of countless albums that suffer from that, where it just sounds
That's a dangerous thing for an artist to do, right?
Right.
You want to have things be kind of, if you're going to have that shift be somewhere, you maybe want it at the beginning or the end.
Right.
Or
side A is this, right, and side B is more catered towards that.
Right.
Yeah.
And this just kind of, this goes in and out. And
what goes in and out, and I think what really keeps it all glued together too is that, like, the quality is just so sharp. I mean, every one of these songs, it's not the longest album. We were talking about hip hop albums. We're dealing with albums that 15, 20, 23 songs. If you got skits littered throughout, I think this is 7 or 8 songs, and
you listen to this entire album in under 50 minutes.
Correct. But I think that's part of what makes it like a classic too, because there's no misses.
Short and sweet.
Like the opener, Stone City High, is very much Parliament influenced.
Oh yeah.
But going back to that being that chameleon, he can, and one thing I love about his ballads too is he toes this line, right, of being extremely sensual and melodic, like the Philadelphia sound, and also being like borderline corny, but it's always worked.
Yeah.
I mean, there are several songs, Dream Maker and how he's singing on that, and Hollywood, and it's just like, it's so over the top, but that is Rick.
That was him.
That's Rick.
That's him. Yeah, right. That's what he is. It's funny because if you break it down to its bare bones, you have on Hollywood, you almost picture like some starlet just like singing to the moon about like, I'm gonna be
hopes
in
and
Hollywood
dreams.
one day.
Yeah.
But it's like,
he pulls it off.
It's a great song. Like it's just a great song. He's just singing to his mom and dad about like,
hey, I'm off.
out.
Yeah,
I gotta go to
I'm out of
Hollywood.
here. Before this, quote unquote ghetto life gets the best of me.
Right.
I gotta bounce. And one thing I love, while we're on the subject of Hollywood, is how Rick goes from that ballad, and then towards the end of the song, you get pure reggae. And I feel like
the beat just switches.
Like Rick in later years never really felt bold. I'm not saying that the music was bad, but it was very formulaic, and you knew what you were getting out of a Rick project. I would say post Glow, or post Cold Blooded, mid 80s.
Yeah.
With this, he's being experimental. He is trying new things, and I think part of the reason that this album holds up so well in 2023 is that because it doesn't feel trapped in the disco lane. It doesn't feel trapped in pure funk, and you got to be in the mood for that. It's not a Philadelphia soul record where it's just nothing but lush ballads. It's a little bit of everything, and because it's so concise, it just feels like this tightly knit product that you can play over and over again.
You know what this album gives me the sense of? It gives me the sense that Rick picked up a little something from everywhere he had been along the way.
Well, that's valuable.
Exactly. Like it's the journey to get to where he ended up to lead up to this album, because Rick had it was a decade plus deep into doing
like formally
music,
being on songs,
right?
Yeah.
And he picked up something between all these legends he worked with at Motown, and between being on the music scene in Buffalo, and between being on the music scene in LA and in Detroit, and in all these different places, which Detroit is just we're going to talk about Parliament soon. Detroit is just a hub for music. Like it is a true hub.
Which is,
for music.
it's so crazy to say too, because unfortunately, if you look at the city for really the last 50 years, they've just let it decay, but it was a gold mine in its era.
It was. And he picked up something from everywhere he went, and you almost you see it in his album. Like he is why he was kind of good at everything. He
had his finger on the pulse of I feel like what people wanted out of
Rick
Motown
was a
at
force
that
to
time.
be reckoned with. And then if you go and look at I was looking at this just for shits and gigs earlier. The quote unquote best albums of 1978.
What do they got, like Saturday Night Fever, the soundtrack on there?
That was a rough year, man.
Yeah. 78. You got Marvin's Here, My Dear, which was another Motown project, one of my favorite Marvin albums, but 78 was, because now you're in the midst of it's nothing but disco, it's like it's getting tired out, and
there's no creativity in it anymore. It's like, oh, there we go, that same old
four on the floor beat, and
that's it.
Get the discotheque popping, and everybody could roller skate around.
Exactly. So yeah, man, I'm looking at that and I'm like, oh shit, we needed a Rick. It was time for that.
Right.
So,
you got a favorite song on this? And favorite song, and then because I like doing this when we do these episodes, any one thing that maybe I could do without that. Is there any bumps in the road along this project?
There's things I want to say that I'm not going to say till the end, just because.
We can save it if you want.
I find it funny to do that. But
okay, well, we can.
But no. This I am going to answer this in part. Favorite song is Mary Jane, and it really it's a two-way battle. It's Mary Jane and You and I, and it's for different reasons. The Stone City Band on Mary Jane,
with the guitar.
And just the backing, the vocals,
backing vocals
are, that's a perfect song.
It is a perfect song.
That's just a perfect song.
Just the melody, the instrumentation, you can understand quite easily why it's been flipped as many times in hip-hop as it has.
You can't make a song better than that. And by the way, only Rick James ever could have made that song.
Right.
And for You and I, it's that horn solo. That shit just gets me every time. I can't not.
Yeah, and shout out to Rick for having the presence of mind to make that song 6+ minutes, because if that were only three minutes, I would have been hot about that. Like, bro, where's the 12-inch version of this? Because I need more of whatever the fuck this is.
Yes,
you know,
absolutely. So is those two songs and mainly those two things that get me. But I will go with Mary Jane. I can't. First of all, I listen to that almost daily,
right?
And if it's ever on anywhere, like I'm
in
the moment with that. Like,
you're in Target, it's like, do you?
It's gonna be stuck in my head for at least the rest of the day.
Yeah. Well, you know mine. I mean, obviously we're recording right now, but how many times have we talked about this album?
Right.
Hollywood, man. Like, Hollywood, I think, is like the perfect representation of everything that Rick is in terms of being able to be versatile on a song, the ballads, the writing, the epicness of it. Like, it gives you that important type of feel. It doesn't feel like a throwaway.
And Stone City, again, providing with their vocals on that. They were amazing on this album.
Yeah,
they really were.
They actually went on to release, like, because Rick blew up like that, like 3 solo albums, group albums themselves, and had some moderate success as well. You know, the Mary Jane Girls, Tina Marie. Rick really, much in a way like Prince was able to do later, really did a great job of introducing his camp
very good with that,
and making that marketable and hopping on choruses or writing a song for the Stone City Band and pushing that. You want to go ahead and get into Parliament? Let's do it. The Mothership Connection, December of 1975. Parliament's always had an interesting story to me because much like we talk about Rick kind of dabbling in, I don't want to call it folk rock, but, you know, different types of music in the 60s, Parliament was doing the same thing as the Parliaments in the 60s, and really was like a traditional doo-wop group with, you know, the waves and the slick hair and all of that. They had an interesting journey, man. You know, they auditioned at Motown in 1962, I believe. And basically what they were told is, listen, we haven't even gotten a hit out of the Temptations. We haven't gotten a bona fide hit out of the Four Tops. This isn't going to work. It's not going to be one of those things. So as the 60s went on, they started to adopt more of that counterculture in their music and really became like a full-blown rock band, right? So Funkadelic success, inspired by Jimi Hendrix, inspired by Sly and the Family Stone, elements inspired by James Brown, kind of started to take off in the early 70s with Funkadelic. But George Clinton, in his infinite wisdom, said, I'm not going to keep just this group on this label. I'm going to call the group Parliament and sign to another label. So what he ended up doing throughout the 70s, and it was kind of groundbreaking really, is he had all of his artists, and they're all in this giant collective, releasing albums under different names on different labels and making all of that money, you know. So their journey's quite interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was genius. Just to provide a little context on that, he basically had a group of 5 dudes that were like his backup band, and they would be the ones who would come to be known as Funkadelic. The reason he lost the name the Parliaments, there was some sort of legal shit that happened. He lost the name to the Parliaments, so he ended up getting that back, but then changing the name to Parliament and then making the collective Parliament Funkadelic.
Right.
George Clinton had a very long journey to get to where they would eventually end up.
Really with this album, because I think this album is the culminate, like it's probably the epitome of their success.
Certainly. It certainly is. Cause you know, like stuff like Up for the Downstroke, like it had moderate
or Maggot Brain or Free Your Mind and Your Ass Will Follow.
Yeah.
Right.
This is certainly the one. Right. You know, you mentioned this huge collective that they had that was, you know, it was kind of originally 10 people, but it ended up becoming this thing where people were just in and out. I mean, literally people would join the band and then be out. Somebody else would join, they'd be out, but then the people who left would come back. And it was just this revolving door of really just this insane, creative, psychedelic rock funk
Right.
type of thing that was like, really, there is no exact precedent for it. There's people who did dabble in it. Like you mentioned Sly and you mentioned Jimi Hendrix.
Temptations, their psychedelic era, Cloud9, all that stuff.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
But this was so different because this was that, as we mentioned before, controlled chaos. This shit would kind of go everywhere.
Yeah.
It would go all over the place. But for some reason, you were tethered. You still were tethered to what the root of this song is, even though it was just the instrumentation.
Oh, it could be all over the place. 6-minute song, and it's changed pace like 3 times throughout.
Yeah.
And I always kind of looked at Parliament Funkadelic as like we're blasting. We're on the mothership, right? We're blasting off into this space concept that George Clinton has created, and he's kind of the anchor. He's like the tour guide almost. Like
he is.
He narrates it, keeping you grounded.
Yep.
Because he's not, he's got vocalists that can blow, man. Yep. Fuzzy Haskins was amazing. His band was outstanding, but Clinton always just felt like the ground, like the anchor, the roots to all of this. And
the ringmaster.
Right. So they form Funkadelic. Funkadelic releases several albums. They reform the Parliaments as Parliament. And I would say in 74, this album, Mothership Connection, came out in 75. In 74, with Chocolate City, is where Parliament kind of started to shift into, they had their own identity almost, right? It's all the same guys, but like Funkadelic remained grounded in that psychedelic, like acid rock.
Yes.
And Parliament was, I hate using the term like glossy or polished or clean when discussing anything Parliament,
though.
But it was much more accessible with their records. When they made a Parliament album, it just felt like more funk than rock.
Yeah.
And Chocolate City kind of blew them up into that category. But let's go ahead and get into the Mothership Connection, because I do think that this is the height of their success. They're one of the first groups that, with this album, introduced that UFO concept and the space concept, and it's present throughout the album. But this also catapulted them into a plateau where they could treat their shows like Kiss was at the time, right? They could get the giant UFO that, as they're playing the introduction, flies in, and here comes George Clinton in this long white suit and the hat and the everything, and like they embodied this like this huge stadium arena type of feel with what they were able to do on this album just conceptually.
And one thing I say should be noted, he was they were heavily influenced by James Brown, and that's no mistake. There were numerous members of the JBs, which was James Brown's band, that would eventually become part of the Parliament Funkadelic collective, most notably being Bootsy Collins.
The greatest bass player of all time.
For my money, hands down. But you also have like Maceo. Maceo was a huge part of the JBs. I mean, some of my favorite songs from James Brown, like he shot one thing that I think is a really cool similarity, and I think George Clinton made it a point to kind of follow in the footsteps of this. James Brown, famously used to, right there on the song, kind of tell his band what to do. It kind of felt like this thing where it's like,
it was regimented.
We're making this song as we make this song.
Yeah.
And except, James Brown would go as far as to find them on the song, keep it in the song, right? Which is hilarious, but
James Brown ran a tight-knit ship.
Very tight ship.
Tight ship, but not tight-knit ship. Get it together, Steven. It's been a long day.
Leave all that in. So George Clinton would kind of do the same thing, minus the fine system, if you will, right? He would be on the song almost kind of instructing them to do something, right? It's almost like making the song while you're making the song, like kind of, I want to add this in here, throw that shit in too. and we're gonna leave all of this in on the track. James Brown so heavily influenced this because James Brown is, known as the Godfather of soul, but he also provided the bare bones for that funk shit that would,
with songs like The Big Payback,
yes,
and
exactly.
all those, yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
for what would follow. And you end up with basically Parliament Funkadelic ended up being basically the best of the best, all coming, people who were influenced by people like Sly and Hendrix, some of which worked with them.
Right.
James Brown and his band, and then all of that bled into Parliament, which was just the perfect mix of, even though Parliament had been around that whole time,
they personified their sound
with
this. Yeah, I agree, because like you said, he did pluck Maceo, he plucked Bootsy, and again, Bootsy is just, even on this album, he's such a driving force. One thing that I noticed in preparing for this episode is that if you were to talk to anybody from the Parliament Funkadelic Collective, George did give them the freedom also, though, to kind of add their own style to everything.
Yes.
And it blended together so well.
Which is, by the way, not a formula I would recommend for anyone.
Right.
And they happen to pull it off so well. It's not always a thing where you see this shit all the time. You see it in sports. Like, let me just go get the collective of the best players and then it should work, right? Well, no, because people have egos, people have preferences, they have ways that they like to do things. Somehow, this giant collective, they still manage to put it all together. Oh, probably the drugs. That's probably what it was.
Yeah.
It was all the drugs.
It's like, let's all just go to George's house and do acid for 9 hours.
Yeah.
And like we said, just play
It was the
and
same
see
acid.
what comes out. Yes.
Yeah.
So, just a phenomenal album, top to bottom. Do you have any personal favorites? It's harder for me when compared to a Rick James project, or really a number of other artist projects, to like find a singular song from Parliament Funkadelic that I can say, oh, this is hands and above, my favorite one, because, and this isn't a knock, but a lot of them,
albums to me.
A lot of them like really play like one long record.
Yes.
So,
in the best way, that's the case.
Right.
Yeah, in the best way, that's the case. I agree with that. But if,
water gun to your head, if you had to pick one.
By the way, it should be noted, as we talked about with Rick, how you can listen to that entire album in under 50 minutes. Well, you can listen to this entire album in under 40 minutes. This album is 7 songs.
7 songs, and some of them stretch, beyond 6 minutes. And
yes. So it really, in that sense, to your point, that's part of why it really does feel like one giant groove session, right? Because some of the songs are long as hell, like. Then it just
when you don't even know where, in a lot of
one
cases,
ends and another begins.
Yeah, you don't even know where certain, like, I'll listen to this album even today, and I've heard it 1,000 times over, and I'll be caught off guard because it's like, oh, that's the end of that song. I'm like a minute and a half into another song already. While you're sorting out, if you had to pick a favorite, I'm going to go ahead and throw mine out there. I'm going to go with the title track, Mothership Connection, Star Child, for a number of reasons. Just vocally, it's incredible. I think it provides a backdrop for a sound that we heard a lot later on, 20 years down the line with West Coast hip hop. And I just love the harmonization, that let me ride, all that. Mm-hmm. Like, Dre just straight up lifted that portion of the song and used it on the Chronic. Really, while we're on that subject too, like, there is no greater influence on West Coast hip hop than Parliament Funkadelic.
I maintain that Parliament and Zapp built
West Coast
hip hop.
Just musically. I mean, you got guys like Gary Scheider
and James Brown.
Right, yeah, James Brown.
But
West Coast, James Brown,
him.
I mean, that's hip hop, period. But guys like Gary Scheider, right, the guitarist on here, he ended up working on 5 or 6 DJ Quick albums. I mean, if you listen to a number of these songs, even from the opening track, you will hear how Dre basically interpolated it. Like P-Funk wants to get funked up. That's basically the Roach outro on the Chronic. So the influence goes a long way. If I had to pick a favorite song, it'd definitely be Star Child. But again, this whole album just kind of rolls into one lump project.
That certainly would be an option for me, just for variety's sake. The other song that I love just as much as that one would be Give Up the Funk. I mean, it just does have that thing to me where it draws me back
Undercover
to,
Brother being burned in your memory also helps.
Yes. And it's just a cool ass song. I don't know what, like, it's one of those things where, like, when I listen to it, I just feel like I'm cool as hell in that. I don't know why. Like,
well, you never will be, but
yep.
I'm glad internally that you feel that way.
That's fair.
Self-esteem, man.
Not the first time I heard that.
Yeah. Probably won't be the last either, you know.
But they have that ability, right, to take somebody like me well past their prime who will never be cool and make me feel cool as shit when I'm listening to it, right? Like, for some reason, I just feel like I'm the man in that moment.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's like you said, this whole thing bleeds together in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost makes it difficult to extrapolate what's your favorite of it, because there's so many, like, there's certain things that just breaks in songs. Like, I think one of my favorite things about Parliament Funkadelic is their bridges in songs. They're so good at kind of going on this, that, they're playing a song for 5 minutes, and then, George is saying, take us to the bridge, and then it's just another 5 minutes of just some,
which almost makes it like
shit.
Okay, you can kind of like extrapolate them into separate songs. 'Cause
right.
I understand what you're saying. It's basically like, well, I love the portion of this song. I love this portion of this song. Yep. Not that I don't like the rest of it, but like these are own little segments within the album.
I have favorite parts of songs that are on the back half of songs.
Yeah.
Like, is one of those things. Like, that's why it was just that giant, funky jam sesh. I can't imagine what it smelled like in that room.
Well, some of the musicians,
and hair on.
Some of the musicians have been on record saying they would walk into the studio and it would smell like, straight shit, and it'd be because George ordered everybody to complete the album or the song before you could leave and go anywhere. So you'd have dudes, just sleeping on the floor. They're tripping balls and they smell because they haven't took a bath in a week. So they're iconic.
That redefines funky. I think they took that a little bit too seriously.
Oh yeah,
I think they still would have done a great job.
What they were able to do with their shows, and really this album just catapulted them into the stratosphere. Flashlight and One Nation Under a Groove and Atomic Dog, and not just Knee Deep. All of that came after this album.
Yep.
I would say that this is the one that kind of put them on at least a mainstream radar.
I mean, again, this was the architecture. This was the foundation.
Right.
This shit built hip hop, and it should be noted, it didn't only build West Coast hip hop. Like,
I know where you're going with this. Yeah, I mean, mention it.
Yeah, just all across
De La Soul,
all across the board. Like, this was East Coast artists also took all of this funk and turned it. It's just that their production was different in the way they did it.
Right,
but
with the break beats and like EPMD when they would use it is a lot different than Dr. Dre when he would use it. And I hate to harp on, we start talking about other artists and albums and projects and influences. But if we were ever going to do that, this would be the group to do that with. Because, again, other than Roger Troutman and Zapp, and they have an interesting story with Parliament Funkadelic in terms of some bad blood.
Yes, they do.
I would say that they created the landscape for the most dominant music of the 90s, which to me was West Coast hip hop.
Yes. For sure. It's one of those things where you're looking at as great as this really is the thing that more than any, I would say on this pod, and a big part of the reason that we wanted to do it is all these things that we love, all these things that we talk about. It's, this is the birthplace. Like, people argue about who was actually the first rapper. Was it Kool Herc, Sugar Hill Gang, all this shit? Like, who actually made the first? Man, the first rappers were in the 70s and shit. Like, these were really the first people that made. This is where hip hop was born.
Well,
like,
and I think I think with Parliament too, like, their music, it's not just about the music, it's about the image, it's about the branding. Everything was so messy but so perfect. I mean, from their artwork by Pedro Bell to
the artwork is outstanding.
To the characters that they would create, and you know, George Clinton said it best. He's like, you know, Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse live forever because they're characters. So if I can create these characters, then this will never die. And funk, and in particular the P-Funk, will never die. I mean, we're nearly 50 years removed from this album alone, and to me, it still hits, you know, the same way I would imagine that it hit for people back then.
You know, and for me, those characters are, you know, Star Child and Sir Nose, Devoid of Funk. Like, those are characters that live forever to me.
There's no Humpty Hump from Shock G and Digital Underground without Sir Nose, exactly. You know, so
exactly. And again, you know, this is the birthplace right here, and it's so many of the things I think people need to realize came from something that was so far longer ago than you thought. Like, where the birthplace of this thing was that eventually led to what you're listening to. By the way, it should be noted, Rick James had Tina Marie rapping in the 80s, which was great. I just wanted to note that because it's great. Yeah, it's just a great thing.
Interesting pivot point, but
it is. It's just funny to me. Like, he had a white woman rapping.
Well, he had funny. The song.
It's debatable that the
too.
First rapper was a white woman. I'm just gonna say. I'm just gonna say.
For the record, ladies and gentlemen, this is not the white man saying that. So I refuse to catch any flack for that. Let's go ahead and let's get down to these projects, though. I mean, I want to put it in this nice shaped, like, okay, where do you fall? But I'm just going to ask you, man, because these are, again, we're doing another episode where I consider these two just super impactful classic albums. What are you picking and why?
For the thing that I wasn't going to say earlier, that I'm going to say now.
Oh, it's Christmas time. All right, now I get to open
that's
this
it.
present.
You were sitting there with bated breath the whole time. Because I didn't want to give it away. It would have given it away, you know.
Yeah, can't show your hand too much.
Rick James is my favorite artist of all time.
Okay. Yeah, I can understand why you wouldn't want to say that earlier.
I don't want to say that in the first 20 minutes of the show. But the reason why I love that we did these two albums is because it has to go against something that's this powerful.
That's on its level, yeah.
So Rick James is my favorite artist of all time, and this is one of his top two albums, in my opinion.
Okay.
And it's literally perfect. Like I was telling you earlier, not only is this album an album where you don't skip any songs, you can't only listen once to the song. Like,
I agree.
You have to listen several times to because the shit is just so. It's not like you're missing some crazy hidden message. No, it just sounds so damn good. You want You want to hear it more, right? So that's how I feel about Come Get It. Like, it's a perfect album. It's one of my favorite albums ever from my favorite artist, Rick James, the baddest motherfucker to ever live. And nobody could tell me otherwise. Now, I can't not go with Mothership Connection.
What? You just pulled the rope-a-dope on me, man. Like, Rick James is my favorite artist of all time. This is a top 2 album, but Parliament.
How do you not go with Parliament? Because as amazing as Rick is to me, it's my opinion that you know, there's a few names that all go at this top echelon of, like, this shit right here built music. And that is Little Richard, that is James Brown, that is Parliament. It's these people that they're so influential, there's not enough time. Like, it cannot possibly be overstated how massive their influence is on everything that came after them. And because of the important, by the way, it's an amazing album too.
Yeah, it's not.
I'm not only picking this because
Right.
of its importance. It's also an amazing album, and an album where I'm not going to skip any songs. Like I said, it feels like an amazing 40-minute jam sesh that I'm listening to. But it is such a massive project from such an important
Entity.
band. Entity is an even better word
Right.
for it. That I'm going Mothership Connection.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to discredit any of the impact side of it, right? I mean, I acknowledge that they are the foundation. I mean, Rick's talked about that. And as unfortunate as it is, you know, some critics in researching for this episode, I went back and read some album reviews from when Come Get It came out. And there's a lot of people calling him like a Parliament knockoff. And I think that that's lazy, right?
It is.
But he was influenced by them.
Certainly.
I mean, like, on the record, like, would show up in documentaries, would be with them. Like, he knows that this helped shape his sound.
Yes.
Love Mothership Connection. But I'm going Rick James.
All right.
Rick is not my favorite artist of all time, but he's in my top 5, right? I don't even know if I would consider this his best album. But in terms of what I enjoy, and simple explanation oftentimes is the best, in terms of what I just enjoy listening to more, because both of these have staying power, Come Get It is flawless in that regard. Again, because you have a piece of everything. You have the ballads, you have even the subtle reggae, you have the funk, you have elements of disco, you have pieces that sound like they were directly lifted from Parliament. Not all, but you know, a snippet here or there. I think that Rick's run from 78 to 83 needs to be talked about more. And the crazy part is, man, I don't think that it ever really got better than Mothership Connection for Parliament, and I'm still going to go with Rick on this.
I would say it got,
just album-wise.
I would say it got as good in different ways and never better.
Okay.
Which is, I mean, still a hell of an accomplishment. Like, but I'd agree with that. Yeah, I mean, this was just one of those ones where throwing on Let It Ride. I will say this about Come Get It. Those songs, Parliament songs are too damn long to be replaying 2 and 3 times.
Right.
You'd be sitting there for 25 minutes listening to one song. Come Get It. I have to keep hearing that shit back to back to back to back. But yeah, man, Rick is the baddest to ever do it. But
and Parliament's the most influential to ever do it. You know, so yeah, you heard it here first. Rick James, Frank's favorite artist of all time, and he didn't even pick him for this episode.
I know y'all all couldn't wait to hear who my favorite artist of all time is.
And there it is. But really, guys, like, obviously we switched it up today. We went a different direction with the music. Definitely encourage you, if you haven't heard these before and you're a hip-hop fan or you're just a fan of music in general and maybe you wanted to learn a little bit more about these artists, these are 2 projects that you can start off with, and we're not steering you the wrong direction, you know. So let us know what you guys think in the comments, and as always, we will be back, with another episode next week. Take care.
Thanks for giving us a listen. Give us your feedback and let us know how you really feel. Subscribe, rate, review, and we'll see you next week.